Patrice Lumumba and the Congolese struggle for independence. In 1960, the Congo broke free of 80 years of Belgian rule, and a former postal clerk named Patrice Emery Lumumba became its first elected prime minister. Within 7 months, he was dead, beaten, delivered to his enemies, and dissolved in acid. This RBG study traces his rise from a village in Kasai, his thunderous independence speech, and the tangled conspiracy of Belgian ministers, Katangan secessionists, and the American CIA that destroyed him. It is the story of a martyr and of a freedom betrayed almost the moment it was won. Why does one murdered African leader still provoke such fierce emotion? Lumumba's ideas were not extraordinary. He wanted a single unitary Congo, free of tribal division. He believed in Pan-African solidarity and a foreign policy he called positive neutralism. But the Congo was vast, mineral-rich, and bordered on white-ruled southern Africa. And in the heat of the Cold War, his independence terrified Brussels and Washington alike. Drawing on declassified files, a Belgian parliamentary inquiry, and the testimony of the men who were there, this study asks a hard question: who killed Patrice Lumumba and why? Part 1. The Making of a Nationalist, from a village in Kasai to the leader of the first nationwide Congolese party. Patrice Emery Lumumba was born on the 2nd of July 1925 in the village of Onalua in the Kasai province of the Belgian Congo. He belonged to the small Batetela people, a detail that would shape his whole political life. His two great rivals, Moses Chombe of Katanga and Joseph Kasavubu, both came from large, powerful tribes that gave their movements a regional, ethnic character. Lumumba, son of a small people, had no such base, and out of that very weakness he forged his defining idea, a movement that was not tribal but all Congolese, speaking for the whole nation rather than one corner of it. Where others built on the loyalties of blood and region, Lumumba insisted the Congo was one country. Its future, he argued, depended on rising above the very divisions the colonizer had so carefully nurtured and exploited, divisions that would soon be turned against him with deadly skill. Lumumba's path ran through the narrow world of the Evoles, the tiny class of evolved, educated Africans the Belgians tolerated. After a Protestant mission school, he worked in Kindu-Port-Ampain, joined the Evolue Club, and began writing essays and poems for Congolese journals. He moved to Leopoldville as a postal clerk, then to Stanleyville as an accountant in the post office, contributing all the while to the Congolese press. In 1955, he became regional president of a purely Congolese trade union of government workers, deliberately unattached to the rival Belgian Socialist and Catholic federations. He even joined the Belgian Liberal Party in the Congo. He was, in these years, ambitious and articulate, but still conventional, a largely self-taught man climbing the few rungs that colonial society allowed an African to climb. In 1956, Lumumba was chosen, with other promising Evolues, for a study tour of Belgium under the patronage of the Minister of Colonies. It was a mark of favor, and it was followed by disgrace. On his return, he was arrested on a charge of embezzling funds from the post office. He was convicted and, after various reductions, sentenced to 12 months imprisonment and a fine. Lumumba always insisted his real offense was political, not financial. Whatever the truth, the episode marked a turning point. The trusted clerk had been humiliated by the colonial state, and many who knew him believed it was prison itself that radicalized him. The cautious Evolue, who had gone to Brussels as a guest, came home with a deepening conviction that the whole system had to be broken. Out of prison and more militant than ever, Lumumba threw himself into politics. In October 1958, he founded the Mouvement National Congolais, the MNC, the first nationwide Congolese political party. Where rival movements spoke for a single tribe or region, the MNC claimed the whole country. His Belgian friend Jean van Lierde later put it simply: Lumumba was the only Congolese leader who rose above the ethnic difficulties and tribal preoccupations that crippled all the other parties. That national reach was both his strength and his danger. To Congolese across the provinces, he offered a single flag to gather under. To the Belgians, and soon to Washington, a unitary movement led by a charismatic radical looked far more threatening than a patchwork of squabbling regional chiefs ever could. In December 1958, Lumumba traveled to Accra in newly independent Ghana for the first All-African Peoples Conference. There, under the eye of Kwame Nkrumah, he met nationalists from across the continent and was made a member of the conference's permanent organization. The encounter transformed him. His language, already nationalist, now took on the full tenor of militant Pan-Africanism, the conviction that the Congo's freedom was bound up with the liberation of all colonized Africa. He returned home no longer merely a Congolese reformer, but a man who saw his country's struggle as one front in a continental war against empire. That vision of an Africa writing its own history, north and south of the Sahara, would echo through every speech he gave and through the very last letter he ever wrote. Part 2. The Road to June 30th. Boycotts, Bloodshed, a Brussels Conference, and the Swift Birth of an Independent Congo. In 1959, the Belgian government, suddenly anxious to manage the rising wave of African independence, announced a program meant to lead to freedom in 5 years, beginning with local elections that December. The Nationalists were unimpressed. They saw a scheme to install compliant puppets before any real handover, and they called for a boycott. The authorities answered with repression. On the 30th of October, a clash erupted in Stanleyville but left some 30 people dead, and Lumumba was arrested and charged with inciting a riot. It was the familiar colonial pattern, a gesture of reform met with protest, met in turn with prison and gunfire. But the violence only hardened opinion, and it made plain that Belgium's careful 5-year timetable was already being overtaken by the impatience of the people it claimed to be preparing for freedom. The MNC then changed tactics. Rather than stand aside, it entered the elections and swept Stanleyville with 90% of the vote. In January 1960, the Belgian government convened a round-table conference in Brussels, summoning all the Congolese parties to negotiate the country's political future. But the MNC refused to take part without its leader, who was still in prison. Faced with a conference that meant little without him, the Belgians released Lumumba and flew him to Brussels. There, the delegates agreed on a date for independence, the 30th of June, with national elections to be held in May. In a few extraordinary weeks, Lumumba had gone from a prison cell to the negotiating table that would decide the fate of the Congo, his authority now impossible for the colonial power to ignore. The May elections confirmed Lumumba's rise. Though the ballot threw up a bewildering multiplicity of parties, the MNC came out far ahead, and Lumumba emerged as the leading nationalist politician of the Congo. There were maneuvers to keep him from power, efforts to deny the obvious winner the right to govern, but they failed. He was asked to form the first government, and on the 23rd of June 1960, he succeeded. A man who 4 years earlier had been a postal clerk and who had spent much of the interval behind bars was now Prime Minister of a country the size of Western Europe. Joseph Kasavubu, leader of the rival Abako movement, would take the presidency. The pairing of the unitary radical and the more cautious federalist was uneasy from the start, and it carried from its very first day the seeds of the crisis that would tear the young republic apart within weeks. Part 3. Independence Day, the speech that thrilled a nation. and helped to seal its leader's fate.
The 30th of June 1960 was meant to be a day of gracious ceremony. King Baudouin of the Belgians spoke warmly of his country's civilizing work. Kasavubu replied politely. Lumumba had been left off the official program entirely. Advised by his friend Van Lierde to seize the moment, he rose anyway and delivered an impromptu address that no one in the hall would ever forget. He greeted not the king, but the men and women of the Congo, and he reminded them that independence had not been granted as a gift, it had been won by struggle. No Congolese worthy of the name, he said, would ever forget that it was by fighting that freedom had been seized, in a day-to-day fight that spared them neither privation nor suffering, and for which they had given their strength and their blood.
Then came the indictment. For 80 years, Lumumba said, the Congolese had endured a colonial regime whose wounds were too fresh to forget. They had known back-breaking labor for wages too small to feed or clothe a family. They had suffered ironies, insults, and blows, morning, noon, and evening. And he named the reason plainly, because we are Negroes. To a black man, he reminded them, the Belgians said the familiar tu, never the respectful vous reserved for whites alone. He recalled lands seized under laws that recognized only that might makes right, one law for the white man and another for the black, magnificent houses for Europeans and crumbling shanties for Africans, cinemas, restaurants, and shops that barred black customers, and the massacres and the prison cells that swallowed all who refused to submit. But the speech was not only an accusation, it was a vow. The Republic of the Congo had been proclaimed, Lumumba declared, and the country was now in the hands of its own children. Together they would build social justice, just pay for honest labor, an end to discrimination, and the full liberties of the Declaration of the Rights of Man. They would show the world what the black man can do when he works in freedom, and make of the Congo the center of the sun's radiance for all of Africa. He asked his people to forget their tribal quarrels. The crowd was electrified, but the Belgians were appalled. The king was furious, and many felt the monarchy had been insulted on its own day of generosity. As Van Lierde recalled, people would later say it was this speech that brought Lumumba's end. Part 4. The Congo Crisis. Mutiny, secession, and a young state torn apart within days of its birth. Independence was barely days old when it began to unravel. Units of the army, still commanded by Belgian officers, rebelled, largely in protest at that very chain of command. In the confusion, the mineral-rich southern province of Katanga proclaimed its secession under Moise Tshombe, Lumumba's longtime enemy. Belgium, claiming only to protect its nationals in the disorder, sent in troops, but they landed principally in Katanga, where they propped up Tshombe's breakaway regime. Without Katanga's copper, gold, and uranium, the Congo was an impoverished shell. So in a single stroke, the new nation lost its army's discipline, its richest province, and any pretense that the former colonial power had truly let go. The state Lumumba had led for less than a week was already fighting for its very life, and the prime minister found himself battling all at once a mutiny, a secession, and the soldiers of the country that had just claimed to set him free. Katanga was no ordinary province. Its mines had poured copper, gold, and uranium into Brussels for decades, and Tshombe was known to be close to the great Belgian industrial companies that worked them. The historian Ludo de Witte, who spent 40 years in the Belgian archives, concluded that the secession was no spontaneous local revolt. The documents, he said, were very clear. The officers and functionaries running Katanga were following orders from the Belgian government, which was secretly protecting its interests and directing the breakaway from behind the scenes. Independence, in other words, had changed the flag over Leopoldville, but not the grip of Belgian capital on the country's richest ground. Lumumba understood this perfectly, and his insistence on a single, unitary Congo put him squarely in the path of those who profited from keeping Katanga apart.
Desperate to expel the Belgians and restore order, the Congo appealed to the United Nations, and a multinational peacekeeping force was deployed. It brought Lumumba little relief. The UN refused to use its troops to crush the Katangese revolt, the one thing he most needed. His own army was an uncertain instrument, his civil administration untrained and untried, and the UN officials on the ground struck him as condescending and assertive, more masters than allies. It is on record, one of the Secretary General's own representatives admitted that Belgian personnel deliberately made it impossible for the UN civilian experts to work. Lumumba had invited the United Nations in as a shield. He increasingly found it a cage, restraining him while the secession it would not fight quietly hardened in the south. The Belgian troops, far from leaving, dug in, and every day of delay made Katange's breakaway look more like a permanent fact.
Frustrated and cornered, Lumumba made the move that would seal his fate. Since the UN would not help him retake Katanga, he turned to the Soviet Union, accepting a consignment of transport planes, military trucks, and, it was suspected, guns, and calling on the independent African states to rally behind him at Leopoldville. To a Cold War Washington, this was confirmation of its deepest fear. The American ambassador took to calling the Prime Minister Lumumbavich. His bitter split with the UN Secretary General, Dag Hammarskjöld, pushed him openly toward Moscow on one side, and on the other, encouraged the United States to organize active opposition against him behind the scenes. Lumumba had not become a communist, he proclaimed neutralism, but in the fevered logic of the age, simply accepting Soviet aid was enough to mark him for removal. Part 5. The Fall, a dismissal of dubious legality, a colonel's coup, and a fugitive prime minister run to ground. On the 5th of September, 1960, barely 67 days after Lumumba took office, President Kasavubu went on the radio and dismissed him in a decree of dubious legality. Lumumba contested it at once and in turn tried to dismiss Kasavubu. Now 2 men each claimed to lead the lawful central government, and the result was stalemate. What the public did not know was that the dismissal had been bought. According to later declassified records, the American National Security Council's special group had authorized CIA payments to Kasavubu just 4 days before he moved against his prime minister. The constitutional crisis that paralyzed the Congo was not merely a clash of personalities. It was, in part, a manufactured one, engineered and financed from outside to break the man Washington had decided it could not abide. Kasavubu and his hastily named prime minister, Joseph Ileo, proved lethargic, and through the following week, Lumumba rallied his supporters in parliament and beyond. So on the 14th of September, the Army Chief of Staff, Colonel Joseph Mobutu, seized power. He kept Kasavubu as president and set up a college of commissioners, young technocrats, to replace the disbanded government. The United Nations troops nominally protected Lumumba, but soon confined him to his residence under informal house arrest. In October, the General Assembly recognized Kasavubu's government, and the independent African states split sharply over which Congo to believe in. The democratically elected prime minister was now a prisoner in his own capital, while a colonel few had heard of a year before began the long climb to the dictatorship that would bear his name for 3 decades. Then Lumumba made what may have been the worst decision of his life. He ran. Late in November, he was smuggled out of his residence in a visiting diplomat's car and set off on the long road towards Stanleyville, where his supporters held sway. Mobutu's soldiers gave chase. Trapped at last on the banks of the impassable Sankuru River, he was caught. He begged the local UN troops to save him. On direct orders from New York, they refused. Flown back to Leopoldville, he was paraded before journalists and diplomats, chained in the back of a truck, bleeding, his hair disheveled, his glasses gone. At Mobutu's villa, soldiers whooped with delight as they beat the elected prime minister in full view of the television cameras before he was dispatched to the military barracks at Thiceville. Part 6. The Conspiracy. The Documents, the Poisons, and the Foreign Hands that reached for Lumumba's life. While Lumumba was being hunted, foreign governments were already discussing his death in writing. On the 6th of October, 1960, the Belgian Minister for African Affairs, Count d'Aspremont-Linden, sent a cable to Katanga's capital stating that policy was now directed at the definitive elimination of Patrice Lumumba. In London, analysts at the British Foreign Office weighed reports from their man in Leopoldville. One desk officer, who would later rise to head the security service MI5, wrote that he saw only two solutions, and that the first, simplest one, was ensuring Lumumba's removal from the scene by killing him. This, he added coolly, should in fact solve the problem. 3 Western capitals, in their own polite bureaucratic language, had begun to treat the murder of an elected head of government as a reasonable instrument of policy. In Leopoldville, the CIA station chief, Larry Devlin, received orders from Washington to await the arrival of a man known only as Joe from Paris. Joe turned out to be Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, the agency's chief technical officer, and he carried with him a special tube of poisoned toothpaste. Devlin's assignment was to slip it into Lumumba's bathroom. It would put the man away, Devlin recalled, and he was aghast. He had never suggested assassination, nor believed it advisable, and the toothpaste never reached its target. He later said he threw it into the Congo River. Devlin suspected the order had come from the very top, and years later, Washington confirmed it. The authorization to assassinate Lumumba had come from President Eisenhower himself, who had been told to see the Congolese leader as a kind of African Fidel Castro. That an American president had personally ordered the killing would stay hidden for half a century. The poison was only the crudest plan. In August 1960, the CIA had launched Project Wizard, a covert action program revealed decades later by researcher Stephen Weissman in declassified files. Hundreds of thousands of dollars and military equipment flowed to a network of top Congolese, among them President Kasavubu, Colonel Mobutu, Foreign Minister Justin Bamboko, Finance aide Albert Ndele, Senate President Joseph Ileo, and labor leader Cyril Adula, the very men who engineered Lumumba's downfall. On the 1st of September, the special group authorized payments to Kasavubu. On the 27th of October, it approved $250,000 to swing parliament behind Mobutu. In November, arms for his troops. The plans and the money, Weissman found, were approved at the highest levels of the Eisenhower administration, the National Security Council itself. For years, the official story held. In 1975, the United States Senate's Church Committee probed the CIA's assassination plots and concluded there was no evidence of CIA involvement in bringing about the death of Lumumba. Weissman's documents tell a different tale. The Congolese who destroyed Lumumba were paid players in a CIA program. They informed their American paymasters 3 days in advance of their plan to send him to his worst enemies, and neither the CIA nor the embassy lifted a finger to stop it. Barely 3 weeks after the murder, the special group authorized $500,000 more, much of it for the very men who had arranged it. Silence and selective declassification, Weissman argued, let Washington blur the history and sidestep any reckoning, while Belgium alone, decades later, would finally confess its share of the guilt. Part 7. Murder in Katanga. The Last Flight, the Firing Squads, and the Acid that Tried to Erase a Man. By mid-January 1961, the central government's position was crumbling, and the troops guarding Lumumba at the Thiceville barracks had themselves begun to mutiny. Western officials feared a Lumumba comeback. The decision was made to move him to a surer place. On the 14th, the commissioners asked Kasavubu to act. Security Chief Victor Ndaka was told to deliver the prisoner to one of the secessionist strongholds, Katanga, the domain of Chombe, his most sworn enemy. The Belgian Minister for African Affairs had already insisted that Chombe accept him without delay. It was, in effect, a death warrant. On the 17th of January, beaten again on the flight, Lumumba and two loyal colleagues, Maurice Mpolo and Joseph Okito, were flown to Elizabethville and driven to the Villa Brewer, guarded and brutalized while Chombe's cabinet decided their fate. That same night, Lumumba and his two comrades were bundled into a convoy that drove out into the bush. It halted beside a large tree where 3 firing squads had been assembled under the command of a Belgian officer, with another Belgian in overall charge of the execution site. President Chombe and 2 of his ministers were present. One by one, the 3 prisoners were stood against the tree and shot. The Belgian inquiry would later fix the time with chilling precision. Lumumba was killed on the 17th of January, 1961, in the jungle between roughly 9:40 and 9:43 in the evening, within 5 hours of his arrival in Katanga. The first and only democratically elected Prime Minister of the Congo was dead at 35, murdered with foreign officers giving the orders and a rival's government looking on. What followed was designed to leave nothing for history to find. The next day, Katanga's interior minister summoned a Belgian police commissioner, Gerard Sweat, and ordered him to make the bodies disappear. How, he said, did not interest him. Sweat and a companion exhumed the 3 corpses from their shallow graves, hacked them to pieces, and dissolved them in acid drawn from Belgian-run mines nearby. "We did things an animal wouldn't do," Sweat admitted years later. "That's why we were drunk, stone drunk." When the acid ran out, they burned the last remains until no trace of the men was left. For 3 weeks, the killer said nothing. When Lumumba's death was finally announced on Katanga's radio, it came wrapped in an absurd cover story of escape and murder by enraged villagers. No one believed it. Part 8. History will have its say. The last letter, the long reckoning, and the making of a martyr. Before the end, Lumumba wrote to his wife, Pauline, words he was not sure would ever reach her. He had never doubted, he told her, the final triumph of the sacred cause to which he had given his life. Belgian colonialism and its Western allies, with the connivance of certain high officials of the very United Nations he had trusted, had not wished the Congo an honorable, unrestricted independence. "No brutality, mistreatment, or torture," he wrote, "has ever forced me to ask for grace, for I prefer to die with my head high." And then the lines that would outlive him. History will one day have its say, not the history taught in Brussels, Paris, or Washington, but the history of the liberated. Africa will write its own history, he promised, a history of glory and dignity. For 40 years, the truth lay buried in archives. Then, prompted by Ludo de Witt's 1999 book, The Assassination of Lumumba, the Belgian Parliament opened a commission of inquiry. Its 1,000-page report, delivered in 2001, traced the secret funds, the role of Belgian advisors, and the fatal split between Lumumba and Secretary General Hammarskjöld. It stopped short of finding a direct Belgian order to kill, but concluded that the government had shown a reckless disregard for his life, that his physical safety had simply mattered less than other interests. Certain members of the Belgian government, it found, bore a moral responsibility for the circumstances of his death. In February 2002, Belgium issued an official apology for its part in the killing, a rare confession by a former colonial power for the very leader it had helped to free and then to destroy. It came 41 years too late for Patrice Lumumba, but it confirmed at last, in the words of his own killer's government, what Africa had always believed. The men who survived Lumumba inherited the Congo. Mobutu would rule for more than 30 years as Mobutu Sese Seko, his US-backed regime looting the country, even as he renamed it Zaire, and with grim irony, proclaimed the man he had helped to destroy a national hero. The Cold War calculation that had doomed Lumumba bought decades of dictatorship and decay. When Mobutu finally fell in 1997, the democratic opposition's pleas for support went unanswered, and the Congo collapsed into wars in which, by some counts, as many as 3 million people would die. Weizmann's verdict was unsparing. By evading its share of moral responsibility, the United States blurred the history and sidestepped any duty to repair the damage. The destruction of one elected leader had set a great nation on a road of ruin it is still struggling to leave.
Why should one man's murder still burn so fiercely in memory? Lumumba's actual program was modest. He wanted a unitary Congo, free of tribal and regional division. He believed, like many of his generation, in Pan-Africanism and the liberation of the colonized. He called his own policy positive neutralism, a return to African values and a rejection of every imported ideology, the Soviet Union's included. But he was a man of fierce will who meant to govern on his own terms, and the Congo was too vast, too rich, and too close to white-ruled Southern Africa for his enemies to risk a radical there. In the paranoid arithmetic of the Cold War, a leader who answered to no foreign master was intolerable, so they killed the man. But as he foretold in his last letter, they could not kill the history he had promised Africa would one day write for itself.
Patrice Lumumba governed the Congo for less than 3 months and died before his 36th birthday, betrayed by his neighbors, his rivals, and the great powers of his age. Yet his independent speech still rings, and his last letter still answers his murderers across the decades. History would have its say, and Africa would write its own. If this study moved you, share it, and subscribe to walk further into the lives that built Africa's long struggle for freedom. Long live the Congo. Long live Africa.